Perfect. Shameless self-promotion. Hope you'll read it. But now we can take it down. Thank you all for being here. It's the end of a long 2 days. We've been in this room without sunlight. Most people have left. As a matter of fact, those of us on this panel, we would have left, but we saw our names in the program, which is why we're still here. And because we've all made it this far, unfortunately, it means that you're all now panelists. There are too few people in this room to have panelists and not panelists. So that's our order number one. And order number two is you've all been sitting here, and if we've heard anything that from all of our lessons, it's you need to eat well and you need to move, and everyone knows that sitting is the new smoking. But I also heard from Kate. Is Kate still in the room here? There's Kate. Kate says that kale is the new smoking. And so I was terrified that we actually had kale at lunch, which I thought was health food until about an hour ago. All right, so everybody, we're going to... In moderation, like crack. Everybody stand up. Stand up. We're going to stretch, twist a little bit to the left, and twist a little bit to the right. We've almost made it. All right, get up on your tippy toes, to your head, and it's all right. Get the blood flowing. Okay, good. All right, now you can sit down. One of the things that I've noticed just sitting here over the last couple of days is that we have a bunch of pieces of stuff. Like it feels that what we are exploring here is something that someday will be a field. Someday it'll be a movement. Someday all of these individual pieces will congeal together into something. And when that happens, the momentum of that thing moving forward will be unstoppable. But what we have now are a bunch of little disaggregated things, and we see it at the level of basic sciences, where there were a relatively small number of people who were looking, even from the academic level, from basic science level, systematically at the whole process, of aging, how it happens, what are its mechanisms, what are the levers. And the reason is part because this field is young, in part it's just because of the way academia works, that you go and you kind of, when you're young, you make a commitment to some big field, and there's a subfield, and then you work with some, whatever, you're a professor, and you find some sub field, and you're all in. And you're pretty much, in most cases, you're all in by the time you're in your early 30s for some kind of approach. And then, if whatever it is that you are focusing on becomes the thing in your field, then you're golden. And if not, if it's somewhere, if it's totally discredited, then you're kind of out and you have to jump to some other lily pad. And if it's somewhere in the middle, you come to conferences like this year after year and you have to say, hey, my thing is more important than it's getting credit for. And that's just, it's in many cases just the way academia works. And there's always this struggle in all fields, certainly in economics, between the pure market model, which is kind of what we're doing, and the managed industrial economy model, where there's some authority, and whether it's the state or somebody else, who says, all right, this is where we are heading. And with this field, there has to be, it seems to me, some kind of balance between those two approaches, because if it's just purely the market, and the market isn't defined, and there's a bunch of people moving in so many different directions, eventually, if you have, it's this thing, if you have an infinite number of, I don't mean this in an insulting way, infinite number of monkeys and an infinite number of typewriters, eventually they'll type out all the great novels in history. And if you have enough people and enough money and enough focus and enough people doing all sorts of different things, eventually we'll get there. But what I think we're going to need to do is to say, where are we going? And can we picture the movement and the field and the direction? And then what are the basic kinds of infrastructures that we're going to need to allocate our resources most efficiently so it's not lots of people moving in a lot of different directions. I know Nir with TAME was talking about that. If you can create an indication for aging, then it has all these follow-on effects that touches on so many other areas. And so that's what I said, that you are all panelists here. And so what I'd like to do, what we've been doing in the past is the moderator speaks, and then the discussants say something, and then with the 4 or 5 minutes left at the end, when we have it, then we open up to the floor. But we're going to turn that around this time. And so the question is going to be for everybody out here, and you can, even for, if you just say 30 seconds or a minute if you'd like to speak. So looking at the macro, like if our goal is to create a field, to create a movement that is going to, in the most efficient way, drive the science forward, drive the translation forward, drive the industry forward, certainly drive the regulatory framework forward in a way that we can speed up something that I think it was pretty clear from this last panel. This is going to happen. And it's going to happen at different paces in different parts of the world, and so there's no reason why it shouldn't happen first here. As a matter of fact, there's every reason why it should happen first here. But I'd like just to kind of go around the room, and I will just point at people. And so don't think that just because you're not raising your hand that you're off the hook. But what are the kind of, if you had to just say one idea, one big idea, that if we wanted to catalyze this field, if we wanted to say what are some big things that either the government can do, that associations can do, that academics banding together into some kind of organized body can do, and I know that AFAR does a lot of work in that regard. What are some big ideas that we might have that can push this field forward in ways that will speed things up more than all of these just different individual movements, individual actions going in a bunch of different directions? Or you can just reject the entire premise of the question. So just, you can raise your hand and you can just shout it out, or you can go to a mic. Yeah?
Well, I would look at three of the biggest breakthroughs in biotechnology. The first, the development of anti-TNFs. Mm-hmm. So...
hold the mic to your mouth. It's on, just hold it to your mouth.
Yeah, okay. The development of anti-TNF therapy for rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis. So it was essentially one persistent person who showed up at the right place at the right time after a biotech company failed on something else. And when they saw initial success, and people have to be persistent, and then they have to show something. The company was in deep trouble. The company was Centocor, and they gave away 50% royalties to two companies who came in with the lowest. Two companies just said 50% would be sufficient. Then they had a coin toss, and Eli Lilly won the toss and elected to choose the other available product because they saw no commercial future in anti-TNF. So first of all, I don't think anyone can predict the future. If a solid, brilliant pharmaceutical company could miss it so completely. I don't know if Joe's still around to validate this tale. Yeah. So you have to have persistence, you have to show something. So for persistence, look at Gleevec. It took about 5 years for the scientific inventors to convince Novartis to do the trial. And look at checkpoint inhibitors in oncology. Jim Allison, it took him about 5 years to convince.
So what are the kind of takeaway core lessons of all this?
You have to be persistent, and then you have to convince somebody to pony up the money, and then you have to succeed in the trial. When that happens, the gates will open up, everyone will jump on and want to meet you.
So your lesson is individual persistence
Yes.
is the missing ingredient. Yeah.
And one other thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it requires, for technologies, something enabling. And you look at other fields and like wireless technologies.
Right.
I had this dumb old wireless thing about 10 years before somebody had it commercially viable. So the first people in were too early.
Yes. So I just want to reference Vadim's presentation yesterday, which I thought was interesting because we had a bunch of people who were talking about individual interventions. And I thought on your chart it was very interesting. You said, well, here are all of the interventions. And so we were trying to compare these different ways of doing things from using a systematic approach that brought everything together. And I thought over the course of the last couple of days, we've had different things. We had some that were on the more systematic side, and then there were some people who were saying, well, I've identified this one intervention, this one compound. And we need both of those, but the question is, how do we think about having a field, and how do we allocate resources toward the whole or toward the specific, as you were saying? Yeah,
very much on the think about the field line, and in a sense of public health perception. It's not been observed that a lot of the people who are getting old these days globally are actually well off and better off than their younger colleagues, particularly amongst today's parents who are relatively less well off. So they're probably interested in investing in the health. Now they understand that there's explosion in the relative proportion of older people. That's, it's in the newspapers, it's in the magazines, it's all around us, it's well understood. What they don't understand is that they're not immune for getting those components of degraded health. And aging isn't a disease, it's the components that go into aging that they don't understand that. So I think until the newspapers are talking every 3 days about, you're going to get a slip disc or a heart attack or lose your hearing or develop cognitive decline, until people have this concept that everyone is going to get it, we're not going to get the push from the public side, which is going to support this. So that, I think, will change the field.
Yeah.
All these people, many of whom have quite enough cash, seeing that there's an initiative which will selfishly benefit them.
Yep, it's a great point. Nir? Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. I'm sorry, I didn't see you there.
Hi, Brian Harvey at Global Liver Institute. The story of the anti-TNFs resonated with me because I was the brand spanking new reviewer at FDA who got to look at the colonoscopies on the Senecor's Remicade trial. And those more senior folks there didn't quite know what to make of it. I won't mention any names, but they're well known. And yet, when I looked at the colonoscopies, and at day 0, the most ugly looking colon with Crohn's that you've ever seen, and 8 weeks later, a pristine colon with the most amazing tissue healing, because of course this is the first time they'd ever been exposed, and at a meeting with the center director, or assistant deputy center director, office director, who eventually went on to J&J, I said, this is going to revolutionize the treatment of Crohn's disease, and they looked at me like, well, yeah, you're new, but it really did. And then later on, when I became GI division director, and we had the Humira folks come, and they said, what can we do to try to get a 6-month accelerated approval, but review, and we said, well, take people who failed Remicade and then show that Humira could treat them, and they did, and they got a priority review. So what I'm saying is we not only need the folks on the industry side and academics, we need to have the resources to get motivated, educated people at the FDA. And until they can hire folks, until they have adequate resources to get gene therapy, I'm so worried that we're not going to have enough people, and FDA now has acknowledged that, that we're not going to be able to get the best people because they're all going to go off to industry. And if we ultimately don't get them at FDA, then we're not going to be able to get these to the patient.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's another thing that this group could do, is to say, well, for this field to move forward, we need to have effective regulators. We're going to have to move on just quickly, Nir, and then Vadim, and then we'll go to our panelists.
Just 2 points. First of all, in my mind, we have 2 missions. The first is our lifespan as a species is 115 years. We can argue. You know, I'm seeing lots of centenarians, so it's real for me. And we die before the age of 80. So I think this is something we can conquer. We should conquer as fast as possible. But, you know, that's not the end. And I think in parallel, we have to think of, so this we can do by delaying aging, okay? But we can potentially stop aging or reverse aging, like you've seen. And I think this is something else that is happening, and we have to distinct those 2 things, because the public doesn't like to hear us living to 150. But I think in our mind we have to walk those directions. The thing for me that I'd like to achieve, I think obviously TAME, by the way, for the industry panel, you know, in 5 years if TAME has positive result, the investment will be, you know, that will be the moment, because that's when pharmaceuticals are going to come in. But I think what we have to consider is the fact that if we really come from aging, and we show that our treatment extends health span and lifespan of animals, and it's phase 1 and phase 2 have shown that it's safe, this should be all a post-marketing thing. I heard that in the Vatican from the Japanese FDA. I think this is a perfect example that you do a post-marketing. You sell the drug, it's not going to be so expensive, and you have electronic medical record that everybody knows, so go and follow the people and see if those drugs prevent a disease, or they're dangerous, or they're okay. I think that's how you have to.
Yep, it's a very good point. And using historical records to do validations going backwards, especially for things that have been happening for a long time. Vadim, and I'm sorry, we're going to go to our panelists after Vadim. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I wanted to make 2 quick points, actually. Nir made exactly the point I wanted to make. I'm just looking forward to his trial, and hopefully it will work. The second point I wanted to make is that age-related diseases that we discuss at this conference is manifestation of aging. Yeah? So ultimately, we want to target aging. But do we understand what aging is? Actually, there is no agreement in the field. And I think people consider aging from a completely different perspective. And I just actually wanted to illustrate this point by asking this audience just 1 question. And the question is, when do you think aging begins? So we know when aging ends, it ends when an organism dies. When does it begin? So who thinks that aging begins when you see an age-related diseases? Age-related disease, cancer, diabetes. Okay. How about when a person completes development? Yes. Okay. How about the age of puberty? No, earlier. Okay. How about minimal mortality? Minimal mortality, the lowest mortality, which is about the age of 9 in humans.
How about conception?
How about conception? Okay. So you see, and I have an opinion which is different from all of you. So, but this also means that we understand aging in a different way. Because what is aging? Aging, in a way, is a consequence of life, of being alive. Yeah, it involves damage accumulation, and the damage comes from every single process. So how could we describe this complexity? Because this complexity is going to be more complex than complexity of life. And so by going to immediately to translation side, going to the, it's good, and hopefully some of them will work. But many of these attempts, it's like alchemist attempts. Like in the Middle Ages, chemists, the ancient chemists, they tried to make gold out of other metals, and they know there are direct reactions. Yeah, chemical reactions, and they are perfectly right. And that's what we are trying to do. I think one key element of what we need to do is invest more into fundamental biology of aging, because the major discoveries will come from there.
Yep.
When we understand aging.
If I may
Great.
Quickly add to that about the...
Just what, yeah. So hold out. So guys, come on up. This is what happens when you innovate. You have opportunities, but I'm sorry on both sides. Anyway, so this was the antidote. I know that the people in the audience were frustrated that all the Q&A kept getting cut off at the end of the other session. So now we've front-loaded the Q&A, and apologies to our speakers who have a little bit maybe less time, but we have a more engaged, mighty few audience. So we're going to, but I'd like for us to continue along this line. For our goal is to catalyze a field. The question is, what role can the professional societies play in catalyzing this field and bringing a lot of different things together? And Karen Tracy, who's Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Integrated Communications at the Gerontological Society of America, is going to be our first speaker. And then the second question is, what lessons can we learn from other societies that are well regulated differently, particularly the UK? And Eric Kihlstrom, who's Strategic Director of Aging Analytics Agency and Secretariat for the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Longevity. So why don't we start with you, Karen?